life on Earth. They committed to halting the extinction of threatened animal, plant, and fungi species. And in an historic first, they also committed to helping those species recover, so that the life we share our planet with can not only survive, but thrive. Making these goals a reality will take all of us working together. Reverse the Red is supporting governments, conservation experts, and communities around the world as they join forces to activate tried and tested tools and tie global efforts to local expertise. All in a coordinated effort to assess, plan, and act for wildlife. Together, we can save species from extinction. Together, we can secure our planet's future. Together, we can reverse the red.
Welcome, everyone, to this special Reverse the Red webinar. We are so excited to have you join us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a very quick introduction of Reverse the Red, and then I will pass it off to our wonderful speakers for the day. So Reverse the Red is a global coalition. Our aims are really stated in that video, and it's to accelerate species recovery. We have our executive committee. We're co-chaired by the IUCN Species Survival Commission and the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And our executive committee also consists of Botanic Gardens Conservation International, Rewild, the Toronto Zoo, and ZSL. And so we are really excited to have this conversation around funding for habitat protection. You may have seen a few messages from Reverse the Red over the past month that we have our own funding opportunity, the Accelerator Award, that is open now, and pre-applications for that are due on April 3rd. And so I just wanted to put a quick plug in there. If you have a species recovery project for a critically endangered, or extinct in the wild species, please check that out. I'll add a link to the chat as soon as I'm done speaking. And we'd love to have Accelerator Award applications from you all. And then another quick mention that we are really thankful for all of the financial support of these organizations. They make all of the Reverse the Red work possible, the Accelerator Award, and all of these webinars. And so thank you to these organizations as well. So we are really excited to host this conversation around funding for habitat protection. Reverse the Red focuses a lot on Target 4 and species recovery, with urgent management actions that are outside of the habitat protection required. But I have James, Dan, and Richard here who are going to talk about all of that really essential habitat protection work for species and species recovery, especially for some of our maybe neglected species. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to James. And as we go through, if you have any questions, please add those to the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom. You'll also see at the bottom of your Zoom that you are able to turn on live captions and translations if you would like those in any language. That will be available there as well. So thank you, James, Dan, and Richard, for joining us for this. And James, I will turn it over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Megan. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody that's joined today. Thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And it's great to see people from so many different places around the world. And I think that really represents the Reverse the Red and the IUCN community. So great to see that representation today. And before I begin, I just want to thank the team at Reverse the Red for hosting this webinar series. I've attended several of these myself, and I've always found them incredibly useful. So I'm pleased to be part of this one. I'd also like to thank my hosts, Richard Cuthbert from World Land Trust and Dan Levin from American Bird Conservancy. Both are conservationists I deeply respect, and they represent organizations doing outstanding work in this space. Let me briefly set some context. First, we are in a really extraordinary moment where political will, global targets, funding, and capacity are aligned, which means there's a real opportunity right now to scale up protected and conserved areas globally. Second, what we want to do today is to give you a clearer understanding of the funders here today, who together are investing tens of millions of dollars each year into this work. And then third, we want to share with you what this looks like in practice, what kinds of projects are getting funded, and how to align with those opportunities. Ultimately, what this session is about connecting opportunity, funding, and action. In December 2022, at the COP15 in Montreal, governments formally adopted what we now refer to as the 30 by 30 target. This is target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And through this, countries have committed to protecting at least 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030, emphasizing not just coverage, but protection that is effective, equitable, and well-governed. So in a very short time, 30 by 30 has moved from science-driven ambition to globally endorsed political commitment, which means land and ocean protection are now firmly at the center of global policy. And the real question for us now becomes, are we actually ready to deliver? Around 85% of the IUCN Red List species are impacted by habitat loss, making land protection one of the most direct ways to reduce extinction risk at scale. Globally, protected areas do make a difference. On average, they reduce habitat loss and support higher biodiversity than comparable unprotected areas. But, and this is important, these results are highly variable. Many protected areas still face significant pressures, and outcomes ultimately depend on where protection happens, how it's governed, and how well areas are connected. So that brings us to the next question. How do we ensure where we're protecting are the right 30%? Because not all places contribute equally to biodiversity or climate outcomes. If we focus on what's easiest or most politically convenient, we risk missing the areas that matter most. This is where science plays a critical role, helping to identify places of high biodiversity value, areas of endemism, and regions that are essential for ecological processes. But it's not just about importance, it's also about feasibility. And the real challenge is aligning biological priorities with what can actually be delivered on the ground. And that often means navigating trade-offs between urgency, opportunity, and long-term success. At the same time, it's important to recognize the limits of science on its own. We often already know where protection is needed. The harder question is how to make it happen, because the barriers are rarely ecological. They're social, political, and financial. Issues like governance, land tenure, local support, and sustained financing ultimately determine whether protection succeeds or fails. So bridging that gap from knowing to doing is really at the heart of this challenge. And finally, when we talk about land protection, we're talking about more than just formally designated protected areas. This includes a broader set of approaches: conserved areas, indigenous managed lands, community-led conservation. What matters is not just the label, but the outcome. Are these areas effectively governed? Are they delivering real conservation results? And are they durable over time? So taken together, this is a space we're operating in, a moment of unprecedented opportunity paired with very real complexity in delivery. And that's exactly where the role of funding and the role of this conversation comes in. So with that, I want to hand over to Dan Leben from ABC to talk about the work that they're leading to stop species extinctions. Dan, over to you.
Okay, I will share my screen. All right. Thank you. Thank you, James, for that excellent introduction to this topic. So American Bird Conservancy is working to close that gap of protected areas for birds in particular. And we've identified 55 species and what they need to meet those goals. So our vision is that every globally threatened bird species in Latin America and the Caribbean is protected within at least one well-managed reserve, because like James said, the major threat to many of these species and other species is habitat loss. If we can protect that habitat, we significantly reduce the risk of extinction. We work through local partners. So we have a network of local NGOs and partners that we work with in Latin America and the Caribbean to do this work, to establish and manage the nature reserves. And we work through those local NGOs as well as local communities and local governments to designate and establish protected areas. We also work with a variety of funders. Some, like Rainforest Trust and World Land Trust, will co-fund our partners directly, and so we will all combine forces and support the same projects on the ground. And others, funders, including foundations, government grants, and our network of individuals, including bird enthusiasts, support us directly to enable this work to happen. Additionally, we're part of this Conserva Aves consortium, which is led by ABC, Audubon, BirdLife, Birds Canada, and REDLAC, which is the network of conservation trust funds in Latin America to finance this work. And so for us, we need to kind of hunt for funding to make these projects happen. And one last thing I'll say on this slide is that although we support land purchases as well as designations, this Conserva Aves initiative is mainly focused on subnational protected area designation, although there is land purchase as well involved. So over time, American Bird Conservancy and our partners have had a lot of success. We've created more than 130 nature reserves for birds and other wildlife. These span over 500,000 hectares and protect habitat for more than 3,000 bird species. But most importantly, it's home to 191 species of globally threatened birds. And that's the main target that we're looking at to reverse the red and prevent extinction. But we want to know which species may still need more habitat protection and how much more and where. So we did a study where we took 129 threatened species from the IUCN Red List. These are critically endangered, and the higher levels of vulnerable in the D1 and D2 categories, which are range restricted or have very small populations. We remapped their area of habitat, their range, and then overlaid that with protected areas. And then we set some conservation targets, which I won't go into too much detail on. And we found that the good news was way more than we expected actually already met their target. But we identified which species were still lacking in protection and found that 10 species didn't meet their first target, and about 43% or 55 species didn't meet their second target. These are those species. It's a long list of birds, but some patterns emerge that aren't surprises. Many of these species are in the tropical Andes, which all of our organizations have worked in. There's another large contingency of these species that are in eastern Brazil, outside the Amazon, mostly in the Atlantic forest, and then some others spread in Mesoamerica and other regions. And we would love to work on all of these. We are working on many of them already, but there are some, let's say the Baudo or Pendle in Colombia is one example, the forest blackbird in Brazil is another example, where we don't have projects for those. And if there is an organization out there that is eager to work on those species, we would love to hear about that and know. These are the 10 species that didn't meet that first target. We are now working on all of them, at least to some extent. And even though they are beautiful birds, many of them are small, brown, or very range restricted, and therefore, believe it or not, have been somewhat neglected. So these 55 species need about 5,500 square miles or 1.4 million hectares of additional protected habitat to meet all their goals. And this is less than 0.1% of the overall landscape. So this is a very small strategic portion of the land that we would like to see protected. And it's shown as these dark purple areas on this map, alongside the lavender color, which is the range of all these 129 species, and in green, the existing protected area network. So a lot of these purple areas that we are prioritizing are outside, they're all outside the existing protected area network and would protect a lot of additional biodiversity alongside those birds. So next steps, we would like to see new and expanded protected areas to cover more of that habitat. We want to ensure good management of those protected areas after they're established or expanded. And for some of those species that I mentioned, where we don't have shovel-ready projects or partners all lined up, we would love to develop such projects and work with partners to do so. So finally, some takeaway points before I hand it off to Richard. This is very possible. Larger land protection efforts like 30 by 30 that James mentioned will not succeed in preventing bird extinctions and many other extinctions if it doesn't include those very special places that we mapped out. And thanks to Conserva Aves, Bezos Earth Fund, Rainforest Trust, and World Land Trust, and many other collaborators, we are increasing protection for many of these GAP species. And individuals can support us through ABC's Bird Habitat Protection Fund as a way to participate in this effort. And I think I will stop sharing there. Thank you. Richard, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Really, really clear. It's great. Right. I'm hopefully sharing my screen with everybody. So welcome all. Thank you for coming along and for the introductions, James, Dan, and Megan. So I'd like to talk about the work of the World Land Trust and the ongoing role of protected areas for biodiversity conservation. And I stress the word ongoing because at times I feel a little bit that protected areas are unfashionable, but I think they're just as relevant as ever. So World Land Trust is a UK-based, it's an international conservation charity that protects the world's most biologically significant and threatened habitats. And our mission is to help people across the world protect and restore their land to safeguard biodiversity and the climate. And one of the founding principles of World Land Trust, it's really quite simple, is that to save species, you must save ecosystems. And to save ecosystems, you must save land. And I can't put that in any better words than Sir David Attenborough, who's one of our patrons. So that's one of the founding principles. It's about land, it's about ecosystems. One of the other founding principles is that to safeguard land and species, you need to put it into the protection of local organisations. World Land Trust, we don't own or manage any land. Our partners do. So we are here to work with partner organisations. I think in a similar way to ABC and Rainforest Trust, we support local partners. They're a critical element for delivering conservation. So World Land Trust has been around since 1989. Some large areas and figures have been achieved over those 35 plus years, including putting over 1.3 million hectares of land into conservation protection with our partners and often with other funders, and also connecting areas, connecting up landscapes, and ensuring that wildlife and habitats are connected and can move. And our approach is quite simple. Again, it's about the land first and foremost, putting that land into protection. It's about where it matters, prioritising, as Dan has just said, prioritising the most key areas for biodiversity conservation. It's locally led, working with trusted in-country experts who know best about what to do and how to do it. And it's putting land into long-term protection. And then lastly, it's about tangible results. We're an evidence-led organisation and we evaluate the outcome and impact of our work to further focus our support. So how does this work in practice with our partners? Well, first of all, we help partners with funds in terms of securing land, and that can fund actions from small-scale land purchases to very large-scale legal declarations and community areas. We help our partners protect sites through their rangers and field teams. our partners monitor sites in terms of the habitat and the species, and we want to make sure that we're not protecting empty forests. Our priority is always around protecting intact habitats, but we also fund restoring areas and the restoration of habitats in key gaps in corridors. And lastly, the elephant in the room, or the rhino in the room, is about sustainable funding. How can we help partners put that land into long-term protection and fund that? And one of the ways we do that is through carbon projects. And I should point out as well that World Land Trust, we provide funding, but we also have to raise funds ourselves to deliver funding to our partners. And I'm just going to focus a little bit more on land purchases. Dan, James and I are sort of talking about different elements, but land purchases are still the most common action for land protection within our partner network. But it's expensive and it limits the area that can be protected. So over the last 5 years, 94% of all the projects we have supported have been land purchases, but they only account for 22% of the land area that we've helped protect. The other 80% comes from large legal declarations or community areas, which are just as important. Land purchase is expensive, but it does remain important because that legal ownership in countries where you can do that, that legal ownership and well-managed privately protected areas are one of the most secure and effective means for safeguarding habitats and species. You can absolutely have control of that site. But as it's costly, we prioritise land purchases to maximise their impact through funding corridors, conservation imperative sites, and sites that protect microendemic species. And I'm just going to quickly give you a few examples of those sort of projects. So firstly, corridors are essential for ensuring connectivity between protected areas and remaining areas of natural habitat, and they actually multiply the impact beyond the actual land purchase area. So this is in Tanzania, where we're working with 3 different partners in between Udzungwa Mountains National Park and Selous Game Reserve. And where funding from WLT, I think from Rainforest Trust as well, first put a key area of land into protection, that dark green area over here, Magambera. And then we've been supporting with our partner STEP this small corridor over the last 3 to 4 years. So the area of that corridor is trivial, it's 187 hectares, but its importance is crucial because it connects over 4.5 million hectares of land. Another area that we prioritise land purchases is looking at conservation imperatives. So this was a study undertaken a few years ago, led by Eric Dinnerstein and other colleagues, in which WRT was part of, which did a similar work to what Dan outlined earlier in terms of looking at where species are occurring and which sites are gaps in the protected area network. And this is an example from Ecuador in the tropical Andes, again with a partner I think we're all working with, between 2 national parks, so Tlanganases and Sangay National Park. The bright yellow colour is the conservation imperative area, and where over the last almost 15 plus years we've been supporting a number of land purchases, those dark green areas with EcoMinga to put those conservation imperative sites into protection. And we've also, in that same landscape, been working to establish the corridor connecting these 2 national parks. The last area I just want to touch on is about prioritising microendemic species. So these are species that have very small ranges or occur only at a very limited number of sites. So typically ranges that are less than 20 kilometres per square is their global range, they're nowhere else. And 2 organisations working in southern Argentina, Fundación Habitat de Desarrollo and Fundación Somancura, are working in the Somancura Plateau in southern Argentina. And this area has hot springs and a really interesting group of microendemic species that are nowhere else other than these hot springs and the streams where they are occurring. So again, 4 land purchases over the last 3 to 4 years, putting about 23,000 hectares of land into protection, but protecting about 30% of the global range of those species. And lastly, I just want to bring it back to partners. We use science to underpin what we do and where we work, but we can do all the science in the world, but without listening to our partners on the ground. We have to listen to them in terms of understanding what the appropriate action is and where it should occur. So local partners are the critical element in all the work we're doing. And with that, I will pass over to James. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. And just as I'm getting my slides ready to share again, I've seen a few questions come up in the chat, and let me just try and address a few of them at a high level, and then we can dig into them at the end as well. There's been a couple of questions about the types of protected areas and conserved areas that are created. And I'll note that between all of our organizations, we're supporting a very wide variety of protection mechanisms. And we're perhaps using some of the language a little bit more loosely than we could. The point being that all of our organizations support work that provide organizations on the ground, whether that's an NGO, a local community group, whatever it might be, to change the legal status of that land. And that can be everything from helping to secure conservation easements on lands, to government designations, to supporting indigenous rights, which I'll talk a little bit about now. So it's that full spectrum, recognizing the land protection, sea protection can take many, many different forms, and has to take account of social and political situations around the world. There was also another question about the social impacts of these protected areas. I'll touch very, very lightly on some of that in the slides that I'm about to share. We could easily do another hour session just on the social impacts of protected and conserved areas globally, but perhaps we can dig into a bit more of that as well at the end, depending on time. So with that, let me turn now to Rainforest Trust. So Rainforest Trust currently directs around $55 million in grants each year towards the establishment and recognition of new protected and conserved areas globally. That's resulted in support for over 140 million acres globally, spanning more than 1,000 protected and conserved areas across 55 countries. But what's particularly notable is how that protection has been achieved. Over time, roughly half of our funding has gone towards tenure-based approaches. That includes securing land tenure, supporting indigenous rights, and enabling forms of protection beyond traditional protected areas. So this isn't just about creating new protected areas. It's about securing the rights and governance systems that lead to durable conservation. And when you look at the outcomes, this approach is delivering at scale. More than 38 million acres, about 60% of Rainforest Trust total area supported that has received protection, legal recognition, comes from tenure-based projects. And that's supported by over $130 million in funding. And there are an additional 40 plus million acres currently in the pipeline that are receiving financial support now towards achieving that goal. A key part of this work is supporting indigenous peoples and community areas, often in the form of ICCAs. These are areas that are not only biologically important, but deeply tied to the livelihoods, culture, and governance systems of indigenous communities. They're voluntarily conserved and managed under customary laws, and in many cases, they represent some of the most effective and durable forms of conservation we have. To make this more concrete, let me give you one example from the Philippines. In the Sierra Madre mountain range, communities worked with our local partner to formally establish an indigenous community conserved area. This built on an existing ancestral domain, essentially strengthening and formalizing stewardship that was already in place. The site protects critically endangered species like the Philippine eagle, along with a range of other endemic species. It's governed by multiple indigenous communities with a clear conservation and protection plan in place. And importantly, this wasn't about imposing protection. It was about enabling it, giving legal recognition and structure to community-led conservation. That said, these projects are not without challenges. Even with designation and recognition, there are ongoing pressures like infrastructure development and the need to align local government support. So again, we see that protection is not a one-off event, it's an ongoing process. But what this shows is there are multiple pathways to achieving durable conservation, and that land tenure-based, community-led approaches are a critical part of this solution. So Rainforest Trusts, like other funders in the space, tend to support two broad stages of work. The first is feasibility, early stage funding to help partners assess opportunities, build relationships, and determine whether protection is viable. And the second is implementation, support to actually secure protection, whether through land purchase, tenure recognition, or formal designation. Both are essential because strong projects don't start at the moment of designation. They are built over time. So how does Rainforest Trust actually decide what to fund? At the highest level, every project needs to meet at least one of three core criteria. The first is species. So projects that protect globally significant populations of critically endangered or endangered species based on the Red List. Ideally, these sites that meet KBA criteria, so they're places that hold a meaningful proportion of the species' global population. And importantly, this has to be backed by recent verifiable data. The second lens we look through is intact landscapes. These are large, relatively undisturbed areas, often forests, but not exclusively. We will also support marine environment work. This can include everything from tropical forests to drylands, high altitude systems to coastal and marine environments. There are also clear geographical priorities, like the Amazon, the Congo Basin, Miombo woodlands, and the islands like Borneo and New Guinea. And the third is climate, projects that play a significant role in mitigating global climate change. That could mean protecting ecosystems with exceptionally high carbon storage, like peatlands, mangroves, or paramo, or projects that prevent substantial emissions or secure large amounts of carbon over the long term at a relatively low cost. So in simple terms, species, landscapes, and climate. Every project needs to clearly deliver on at least one of these. But in reality, the strongest projects often deliver across all three. So if that's what a strong project looks like, what tends to go wrong? There are a few common failure points we see again and again. One is unclear or insecure land tenure. If it's not clear who owns or governs the land, it becomes very difficult to move forward. Another is limited local support. Projects that don't have strong backing from communities or key stakeholders are very hard to sustain. We also often see challenges around governance. Even if a site is designated or recognized, without clear management structures and long-term stewardship, outcomes can fall short. And finally, a big one is understanding the time and complexities involved. Moving from an idea to implementation can take years and requires sustained efforts, partnerships, and resources. So again, this reinforces this key point. Successful land protection is not just about identifying the right places. It's about building the conditions that allow protection to actually succeed. So stepping back a moment, we've talked about the scale of the opportunity, what strong projects look like, and some of the common challenges in getting there. But an important point to emphasize is that funders represented here today are only part of a much broader ecosystem. There are many other funders working in the space. And one of the things that makes this moment particularly powerful is that funders are increasingly connected. Their collaborative funding networks, regular information sharing, and a real effort to align on priorities. And that's actually very good news for applicants because a strong project doesn't just live with one funder. When a proposal gains traction, it's often seen, discussed, and supported by multiple funders, which means that the best ideas have the potential to scale far beyond any single grant. So in many ways, this is not just about accessing one source of funding. It's about entering into a broader system that is actively looking for impact. Well-designed projects. With that, I'm going to pause and open up the floor for questions. And thank you again, Dan and Richard, for the great oversight of the work that your organizations are leading. So I'm going to stop sharing now and move into some questions. I think there are many already in the chat. Where to start? Dan and Richard, if you see a question you want to tackle, please do, as I'm getting on top of these.
I'm happy to respond to one question, and there's someone has passed Onja. You've asked about plant microspecies, so very good question. I think I've prioritized exciting photos of birds and other species, as we tend to do. The conservation imperatives framework explicitly includes plants and rare plants in the layers, and in terms of how those sites were prioritized. I think plants are, I think we recognize, widely overlooked in conservation prioritizations, partly because we know less about where they are in comparison to terrestrial vertebrates. Within World Land Trust, plants are absolutely a core part of the projects and that we support and what we prioritize. We've also helped to address, I think, our lack of understanding about plants by working with Kew. We have a conservation advisory panel. The director of science from Kew sits on that panel to help World Land Trust actually, for plants, where should we be working? So yeah, plants are absolutely part of the picture of what we support.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. Okay, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I've seen a number of questions that seem to ask about what kinds of organizations we all support, and do we support young organizations or small organizations? And I thought maybe we could all address that briefly. From ABC's perspective, we have supported organizations of all sizes, some that are well established and old and large, others that are only in their first couple of years of existence. It's really dependent on the nature of the proposal and what they're proposing to do. In some of those cases where we've supported young startup organizations, it's been a really incredible form of validation that then they've been able to use to go on to do bigger and better things, including with future funding from us or other partners. Sometimes it may take the look of starting with a small research project, and then that goes well, and that leads to finding an area that's really important to protect, and then actually doing land protection afterwards. So there's lots of different paths that can follow, but I think it starts with a great proposal.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. And let me add to that. All of our organizations prioritize working with local organizations, those that have the relationships with the communities, that understand the political and social contexts. We also recognize that many of those organizations might not have the experience or capacity to pull together complex application forms. And so when we come across those situations at Rainforest Trust, one of the things we will do is, one, we have staff there to help you write those applications, but we also have brought in consultants to sit with you in your offices or in your communities and help to develop those applications. And in developing those applications, thinking about what is actually needed. Throughout these presentations, this is not a one-off event. These are long-term endeavors. And so thinking about what is going to be involved across that timeline is really important. And providing our grantees and our applicants and our partners with support to think through those challenges is really key. One of the other questions I've seen, yeah, Richard.
Sorry, James. Can I just quickly add to that, because I think it's a key question, and I think it's, we receive lots of applications from that just aren't suitable. So we do not fund individuals, and we frequently have requests in from individuals. It needs to be a locally registered organisation. We like to see a bit of a track record of delivering. We'll typically start small and then grow. And I think, as you've just iterated, James, we are there. We like to work with organisations to improve their proposal. Even if we don't fund it in the end, they'll have a better project proposal and a better conservation case at the end of the day.
Brilliant. Thank you. Just a note on individuals, I think that's worth saying, that there are so many great organizations out there doing this work, that being individual scientists partnering with the right institution can be a really powerful combination. So we're always happy to make those connections as well. There are a lot of questions. Just a quick one about the size of areas that we all support. I don't think there's a minimum. I think generally we want to know that the target species are going to be protected. So if the argument can be made for that, then great, let's talk. Also, a question around supporting livelihoods. Maybe I'll tackle this first and then hand over to Dan and Richard. As I mentioned, about half of our work is supporting land tenure-based projects. Whether they are land tenure-based projects or not, so much of the work that we do in this space now, particularly for larger areas that do involve communities, which is the vast majority of any of this work, has to include some level of support for livelihood, whether it's delivered through this fund or as I talk about these other funder networks, we can often collaborate to bring in those different sources of funding to deliver at scale. Support for livelihoods and support for communities is absolutely critical. It is a fundamental for a protected or conserved area to be a success. Without that, it is very, very difficult for these things to work. So really, really critical. And I think most of us funders recognize and contribute in some way, shape or form. Dan, Richard, anything you want to add to that?
I think that's a good summary, James. For World Land Trust, yes, there's lots of important livelihood projects on their own. For us, it has to be critically linked to the land protection. We won't just support a livelihood project as it stands, important as that may be. It has to be a crucial part of that land protection. But as you said, James, any community project or land tenure project, that's part of the package that comes with it and ensures sustainability.
Right. Thank you. I see a question from Vicky Wilkins about invertebrates. Vicky, I'm going to throw this back to the IUCN Invertebrate Conservation Committee and challenge the committee to come up with the top 10 sites globally for the protection of invertebrates. And when you have that list, please come back to us and let's talk about it. We'd love to see some protected areas established for invertebrates, and we're ready to support. So we'll see what the IUCN community can come up with in terms of priorities. Freshwater fish and rivers. Yep. Yeah, I think the question around freshwater conservation is really important. Being able to think beyond an individual river. Within the donor circles, definitely seeing increased interest in thinking about the connectivity of freshwater systems and how we can support freshwater conservation at scale. So I think there's a lot of interest there, and it goes beyond just supporting individual land purchases, but thinking about systems approaches to protected and conserved area creation. Many of the projects that I think we work on don't revolve around one protected area type in one location. It's thinking about landscape scales. Working on a project in northwestern Ecuador right now. 1 million acres where there will be 10 different forms of habitat protection occurring within the landscape. And I think those kind of models are really important, and freshwater is a key indicator of success in that project. Dan and Richard, any questions you want to tackle there?
Looking through the questions, there's too many questions.
There's a lot of questions.
Trying to answer questions on the side as well, but I think you provided an excellent overview. Maybe one more thing to say about ABC, which I did not say in the introduction, is that the topic of this conversation, of course, is about protected areas, and so that's what we're focused on. ABC does do work outside of protected areas, and we mainly work inside the United States and North America, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean. We've also funded some science and Alliance for Zero Extinction work outside the Americas, but just in terms of people's expectations of what we do outside of the Americas, I think that's important to state. And I think there are a lot of questions about sort of eligibility and what can people ask for, both inside protected areas or outside protected areas, or inside existing protected areas. There are, of course, a lot of important actions that people can take and do to conserve species within existing protected areas, but establishing new protected areas isn't the solution to what has to happen within existing protected areas. So, but we definitely support actions across the spectrum of conservation of what species need.
quick response to one question, and there is a question about appetite from your organisations for genetic, bio, and cryobanking. From World Land Trust perspective, that's not something we'd support. There's other donors who are interested in that perspective. We are focused on land and habitat protection.
Agreed. I'm looking at a question about the Philippines, private islands available for private ownership. Assuming that they have resident threatened species, is an island-based wildlife reserve feasible for funding? Absolutely. The highlands and islands being such important sites for high levels of endemism and threat make them a high priority for funding for many of the funders out there right now. What makes those projects a success? It's similar to many others: community support, clear strategy for long-term funding mechanisms to ensure success, and a strong legal framework for that protection. Anecdotally, and I'm not sure if Dan or Richard have seen or agree with this, but in terms of how long it takes to create a protected area, and these are similar situations that we're talking about within islands, it can take 10 years from research groups getting on the ground, starting to engage with communities, or NGOs engaging with communities, before the communities are even ready to talk about what a potential protected or conserved area could look like. These are not quick projects, and those projects that try and move quickly are often going to struggle later on with some of the social complexities. So taking time to really develop these initiatives is really important. And of course, that is challenging in the moment we live, where 30 by 30 is on our doorstep, and there is such a global push to get protected areas created, that making sure we get that right balance of proper community engagement and support and awareness is absolutely critical.
I think I agree, James, in terms of the timescales. There's a lot of work, a lot of planning, and timing. The timing between finding a site. I think those questions and points you raised in your talk, James, and in terms of understanding that ownership, it's often where projects founder.
Another good question about, aside from securing funds, what are the biggest barriers right now to funding more habitat protection work? It's a great question. Maybe I'm going to hand this over to Dan and Richard, and then I'll give my response. Dan, Richard, who wants to go first on that one?
Well, I think we've mentioned already that good proposals that meet the requirements and eligibility of the different donors and the interests of those donors is something that is somewhat of a barrier. Also, there are political disruptions that can either disrupt designation processes, or just the world is a volatile place, and so that can create additional delays or barriers. And then I think also the post-designation management work, there's a lot of demand and need for that. And so I think there is some questioning of, well, there's a certain amount of capacity out there. And so if certain groups or governments are struggling to manage protected areas that already exist, then that may slow the real important need to continue building that network of protected areas at this critical moment that James is talking about, where the different interest groups are aligned, the funding is aligned, and we're at that moment, that inflection point in the planet, where now is the time to protect that habitat before it's gone.
Thanks, Dan. I think from my perspective, one of the barriers, ironically, is finding the right local partner organizations. I think particularly in Asia and Africa, and I often say there's no shortage of good projects, but finding the right partners to deliver the projects sometimes is an obstacle. So yes, if there's other organizations out there, then we need to hear about you and what you're doing. I think another obstacle or something that I worry about is it's the ongoing management and protection of sites, and the long-term funding and the sustainability for that. That gets ever more challenging. Everyone likes something shiny and new. The long-term maintenance of sites, the long-term funding for organizations and the boring operational costs for your staff and teams and accountants that all organizations need, that is always a challenge to fund. I wish it wasn't so, but it is one of the barriers in my mind.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan and Richard. I'll add one there that really speaks to the moment we're in. Right now, there are more opportunities to create protected and conserved areas than any other point in history. And I think that's incredible, and a really exciting opportunity, but it also comes with a massive amount of risk. It's absolutely critical that over the next 4 or 5 years, we're not creating and recognizing protected areas and conserved areas in an inappropriate way in inappropriate locations, that these are done well. Any of these areas that isn't recognized correctly jeopardizes more work around the world than the individual projects. So making sure this is done right and delivering genuine conservation results and durable conservation results is really critical. So although we need to move fast, we need to move cautiously, and we need to move appropriately and sensibly. Another question about how do you, a great question here. How do we balance continuing to support these established high-performing partners while still ensuring space for new and emerging organizations to compete? What criteria and mechanisms do you use to manage that trade-off?
That is a good question. I will attempt to go first. I mean, we have a network of existing partners. I don't see any lack of ambition from those existing partners to continue doing good work and continue expanding their impact. So as long as they're doing that, we'll support them. That doesn't preclude World Land Trust from taking on further new organizations in key areas. So, you know, I think we're interested in supporting both. You know, we have long-term relationships with partners. As I said earlier, we're looking for new partners.
Brilliant. I'll jump in next because it's a great question. We've actually included in our next strategic plan, which we're just finalizing. And within that, we've got 75% of our grant making going towards local and national NGOs, but 30% of our projects being with new partners. So we recognize the importance of working with new groups out there, and that there are many fantastic groups that we're not already working with. So we're really setting a target around that will force us to engage with these new groups that otherwise we haven't connected with yet. There are so many great organizations out there doing tremendous work. So really committing to that. Dan, do you want to add anything to that? Otherwise, I think we've probably got time for maybe one more question. So if each of you,
let's
something
see
you want
if
to
there
grab.
aren't other questions. Maybe I know that we were thinking about it might be useful for listeners to get our perspective of what success might look like, or what are some of the indicators of that. And I think beyond just designating or establishing a protected area, I think it's very gratifying to see through our partnerships that may last decades how those reserves thrive, how they succeed in maybe not just maintaining the habitat that was there, but also recovering degraded areas. And if we do restoration on those reserves or in the buffer zones, I think it's extraordinarily gratifying to see individual conservation practitioners in those partners and at those reserves grow in their careers. And maybe they start out as park guards, and then or some biological researcher role, and then they become project officers or conservation directors at those organizations, or even go on to lead leadership positions at other organizations. So that's extraordinarily gratifying. And I think good conservation will show those kinds of results as well.
Thanks, Dan. I think from my perspective, I think success, it is long-term projects. Conservation doesn't happen in 3-year funding cycles. We all know that. It doesn't happen in 5 years, it happens over decades. Some of the examples I provided in my talk from Ecuador was showing, land purchases that have taken place sequentially for 15 to 20 years, building up that vision for an organization, that vision for an area. I think another measure of success is providing almost catalytic funding. So that first funding that World Land Trust or any other land funding organization provides can often just give an organization a critical boost and critical credibility to then get further work and further funding. I've seen that with multiple organizations where that one land purchase, it puts their mark on a map, and they can then get subsequent land purchases or subsequent land protection measures, not just purchases. And I think the last thing is, in terms of what does success look like, it's that habitat and the species are still there 15, 20 years on. There are healthy, functioning ecosystems. That's what we all want to see.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan and Richard. I think given we're at 4 minutes, we probably don't have time to tackle another question, but there are many, many great questions in there. Let me close by first thanking the Reverse the Red team for hosting this event. It's been really exciting and wonderful to see so many questions in the chats. Dan and Richard, absolute pleasure working with you on this. Thank you so much for your time and the amazing work that your organizations are doing. And thank you to everybody online. It's really exciting to see such a dynamic conversation about such a critical issue. And please see this as the beginning of the conversation, not the end. We're all accessible through our websites and our organization's connections. So please, we're always happy to explore these projects. And I think a big takeaway here is that we are in this incredible moment in history. And things like application forms and strict criteria should not be limiting conservation. We're all humans here. We all have the same desire to see the world a better place. So reaching out to us and having these conversations and exploring what can and should be done is really important here. So again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to all of those around the world that are up late or up early. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.